At 19, every new infatuation an unkind word, a retroactive word, and so a lying word seems the only chance at romantic happiness that will ever present itself. Thus throughout December of 1953, Marian Martinson was distraught. For weeks, she'd loitered in a vestibule with an eye on the letterbox, conspicuously trying to look inconspicuous. Now that the holidays had descended, deliveries were suspended. The cruelty of a certain young man desisting from communication during this, of all seasons, defied everything she thought she knew about the boy. Finally her mother insisted she explain why she was so mopey and cross. Private if not secretive, and leery of fielding her parents' hostility to Germans, Marian had fobbed off Eakert's letters as pen-pal correspondence organized by their church, thus portraying the exchange as a tiresome, dutiful exercise in compassion. Besides, she dreaded an adult's insulting sense of proportion. Hard to believe now, but you'll get over this kid in no time, turning the most momentous experience of her life into a passing craze, like coronation chicken. So Marian claimed to be upset that, despite the Tories having come to power with all their promises, throughout yet another Christmas, rationing was still in place, and she'd had her heart set on baking a butterkuchen. Indeed, Eakert had sent his mother's recipe in mid-November, the last time he'd written, in a missive already soft from smoothings and refoldings. He'd warned that if you substituted vegetable oil from the big 18s from America, the cake was equal halves disgusting. Her mother admonished her to be grateful for the peace and bounty God had granted them, and to stop being such a bill. Over strenuous parental objections, technically, West Germany was still occupied. The previous summer Marian had taken part in a UN reconciliation camp, in which young people from Allied countries pitched in with their defeated counterparts to help clear remaining rubble and sow vegetation. Only 11, when the war ended, and exiled from London while it lasted, Marian had felt left out, only grasping in later life that sometimes exclusion made you lucky. She'd leapt at the adventure. In cultivating cross-cultural sympathies, the camp was a resounding success. From the start of her 8 weeks in Leipzig, Eakert Weber attracted her attention. Some of the Germans were defiant and standoffish, others unpleasantly cringing, or simply broken. Though gracious, Eakert never acted apologetic about horrors for which he bore no personal responsibility, and of which he and his ruined family were also victims. A resentful draftee, his father had hated the German army, and deserted at the first opportunity. Their house was firebombed to a cinder, and when 10 Reichsmarks became 1 Deutschmark in 1948, the Weber savings melted as well. Eakert was a hard, uncomplaining worker. His English was hesitant but grammatically perfect, having to search for his words. He considered what he said before he said it. His features were chiseled from a meager diet, his brown eyes deep-set and steady, and his smile was warm, even if it hurt on the grim side. He hadn't been sent away, so he told wonderful stories. She was astonished to learn that, after the war for 5 solid years, his father had been press-ganged into forced labor by her own countrymen. By her return home, Marian was smitten. But even if her parents had allowed costly international calls, the Webers had no telephone. The courting couple was dependent on the post. Much of their feverish correspondence since August had addressed how in heaven's name to meet again. Yet after weeks of silence, her last letter still unanswered. By the new year Marian had resigned herself. The young man's infatuation, in her diary, she used that very belittling word, had clearly dwindled. Eakert must have met someone else, a German girl, who understood the special trials of their humiliated people. Marian had no way of knowing, of course, that her swain had in fact toiled for days on a lovingly handmade Christmas card, with intricately snipped paper snowflakes and stars and folded gum wrappers. Inside, with typically Teutonic neatness, he had tightly printed a rash message. The postage was dearer than for the flimsy airmail letter skim envelopes they'd used hitherto, but in this remarkable era of Wirtschafts wonder, perhaps he could afford the extravagance. Although the card went its successee to a sorting office in Croydon, there an exuberant postal worker had learned that very morning that his wife was expecting their first child. In expressing delight to co-workers, he thrust out his arms, and one finger flicked a stiff envelope. It sailed from atop the pile and disappeared under a heavy franking machine. Meanwhile, Marian was drenched in shame. She'd besmirched the holidays, her friends and family with her selfish sulking. Surely the worst possible response to sorrow was to inflict it on those you loved. She'd been a foolish flibbertigibbet to take the sweet nothings of a foreigner at face value. She remained certain that her own feelings for Eckert, deep and true, constituted her only chance at lasting love. Some hearts, once given, were irretrievable. But in that case, she had to buck up, and devote a life she now barely cared for on her own behalf to others. She joined the International Red Cross. By the time an especially diligent cleaner in Croydon fished out the dusty envelope, Marion was helping with resettlements in South Korea. Anxious that having been too sharp with the girl had triggered this disastrous doggetting, Marion's mother was devastated by her daughter's departure. On receipt of the envelope from Germany, still grimy along the flap, she assumed that this was merely another newsy dispatch from that church-sponsored pen pal. She only added the airmail stamps to get credit for being a faithful mum. Unfortunately, postal deliveries in South Korea were still patchy, well after the truce. Her mother's Christmas package that year of tinned corned beef, milk chocolate, and painstakingly wrapped butterkuchen never did reach Marion, though or so the kind young woman reasoned. Whatever desperate soul had nicked the box probably needed the nutrition more. By the time Eckert's card arrived at the Red Cross outpost in Jangok, horrifyingly close to the demilitarized zone, the Soviets had moved tanks into Budapest, and Marion had been reassigned to the Hungarian refugee crisis in Austria. Generous to a fault in preference to wallowing in her own melancholy, Marion Martinson had been popular in Jangok. A colleague made sure to forward the envelope, pasting still more stamps over those from Royal Mail. Alas, in Eisenstadt the card was mistakenly placed in a box of post for refugees, many of whom were trying to locate one another, and ended up in the hands of one Marika Manchki, presumably the nearest nomenclatural match. Not looking closely, Marika stuffed the envelope hastily in her bag and jumped on a lorry to Yugoslavia. Marika had fled Hungary with few possessions, so after settling in Ljubljana she quickly discovered the error. Grateful for rescue from Soviet brutes, she parted with some of her small stipend from the Red Cross to post the misdelivered epistle back to Austria. Yet Yugoslavian stamps used cheap glue, and the higher denomination one dropped off. Workers at the main post office were sticklers, and, like so many postal employees whose wives weren't newly pregnant, disgruntled. Correspondence with insufficient postage got pitched to Staney in the dead letter bin, which is where Eckert's paper snowflakes and gum wrapper stars spent several years. Fortunately, much of Serbia was devoutly Christian. An especially pious Orthodox postal worker pawing curiously throughout the bin never empty. This was Eastern Europe recognizing a beaten-up envelope with a strange pentimento of address labels and stamps from different countries as displaying the distinctive rigidity of a Christmas card. It was December, and a small enough act of seasonal decency to add the extra stamp. By then, the refugee operation in Eisenstadt had long finished. The card was forwarded to the main office in Vienna, where an affectionate former colleague of Marion slipped the battered envelope into a new, larger manila one, copied out the barely discernible return address, and sent the refurbished communiqué to Buenos, where 12,000 Iranians had recently perished. It isn't easy to deliver post in the desolation of an earthquake zone, however. When the card finally arrived at the ad hoc dormitory where Marion had laid her head, she was on her way to Vietnam. If no longer a kid, Marion was only 30. Vigorous good works had maintained her figure. Thus she'd drawn the eye of a superior in Saigon named Hartley Wilson. If only to get his paws off her, she explained in all sincerity that her heart belonged to Eckert Weber, neglecting to mention that she hadn't seen her old sweetheart in over a decade. So when her boss spotted a manila envelope in her pigeonhole from this dratted German guy, he snatched it. The theft was irrational, and Hartley felt just funny enough about the malicious impulse that he didn't destroy it. The Red Cross operation dragged on for years, along with the war. When Hartley at last shipped back to the States, amid tattered love letters from old flames extinguished, he found the packet from Leipzig, Spidey confiscated. Sheepish, he marked it Oppo Army postage was free, and the military worked with IRC, returning it to that cold fish underling, without explanation. But American forces were pulling back, and Marion had already been transferred to Bangladesh. Postal services in the Third World are notorious. Eckert's card jammed in the crevices of post bags, slipped from overstuffed duffels in the holds of prop planes, and got kidnapped by insurgents. It was tracked on the backs of donkeys, packed into the saddlebags of camels, plowed along dirt tracks on motorbikes, and bicycled across mud flats. Each time the envelope finally reached its destination, Marian Martinson had moved on, from the famines in Uganda and Ethiopia, to the Gulf crisis, to the famine in Somalia, to Sarajevo. From the conflict in Chechnya to the famine in Sudan, from the earthquake in Colombia to another famine in Ethiopia, where at least she already knew her way around. From the factional fighting in Congo to the ructions in Afghanistan to the mire of Iraq. By the time she had finished with the famine in Niger and moved on to Darfur in 2008, she was 74, weary, and no little discouraged by the human race. It was time to go home. For the first time, Ekert's guard preceded her. Some Red Cross bright spark had thought to forward the packet, now padded by several protective envelopes, to her family's address in Streatham. But Marian's elderly mother had just died, and in the subsequent disarray the card got sandwiched between unread copies of a week. It was another 9 years before a grandniece helping Marian sort her papers found the envelope. Like most liver cancers, Marian's was terminal, and she wanted to leave her affairs in good order. A mess of unpaid bills would make for a piss-poor Christmas present to her younger sister. Liebling, the niece read aloud, for her great-aunt's vision was failing. What a pity the old woman could barely make out the charming snowflakes and silver stars. I wish you and your family the happiest of Christmases, but this is not my prime purpose. I know we are young. Yet I know, my heart,